Human radiation experiments, USA. Humans learned a long time ago never to play with fire, but it took a while for us to learn that nuclear energy isn't a toy that we could play with either. In fact, the USA even conducted human experiments involving radiation. But the twist here is that the people involved in this experiment weren't even aware they were test subjects. These were your regular hospital patients, just minding their own business in the hospital, but were already getting exposed to radiation without their consent. Think of yourself getting circumcised while a random scientist was injecting you with radioactive contaminants. However, most of the victims were people suffering from terminal illnesses. Scientists were like, hey, this dude's about to die, so maybe it wouldn't be too wrong to stuff him with plutonium. So even though these people were about to die, they were made to suffer from radiation-related illnesses before death. It's like rubbing salt on a wound. Pregnant women weren't spared from the tests because the government wanted to know how radiation can affect the development of a fetus in the womb. As a result, infants exposed to these tests came out suffering long-term health issues, including cancer. The Buchenwald experiments, Nazi Germany. During the Nazi period in Germany, the government tried to prove a point that Germans were superior to other races, prompting them to conduct experiments that were supposed to make the Nazis stronger. But instead of conducting the experiments on their own people, the Germans were like, okay, let's be sure about these experiments and test them on other people first. So what they did was to use the Jews of the Buchenwald concentration camp as their test subjects, because they never saw the Jews as people. The Jews were subjected to experiments involving diseases, like tuberculosis, because the Nazis were trying to find a vaccine to make their people immune to it. On top of that, they also injected toxic substances into the Jews to test out how long a person can survive. The Nazis pushed the limits of the human body to make their soldiers stronger. Most, if not all, of the test subjects died because of these experiments. The ones who survived were still eventually killed in the concentration camp. None of the treatments and tests proved useful to help Germany win the war because, as we all know, the Nazis lost. The Vipeholm experiments, Sweden. Well before 9 out of 10 dentists recommended Crest as their go-to toothpaste, dentists in the 40s and 50s conducted experiments at the Vipeholm Hospital, home for individuals with intellectual disabilities, to test the effects of sugar on dental health. Some patients were getting more sugary foods, like caramel and chocolate, while others didn't get the same amount of sugary treats. The goal was to compare how fast sugar can affect tooth decay. Put yourself in the position of one of those patients in the hospital. You're there getting treatments for your mental disability, but doctors keep stuffing candy down your throat multiple times a day to see how sugar can cause tooth decay. As expected, those who ate more sugar suffered more dental problems. The sugar rush and cavities were only half of the bad parts because residents ended up experiencing extreme pain and suffering due to the high sugar diet. This may have been one of the first studies involving the effects of sugar on your teeth, but it was done unethically. These dentists probably didn't think that people with mental problems would mind eating candy all day, believing that they were a bit too disabled. Operation Midnight Climax, USA. The larger MKUltra program of the CIA during the 50s and 60s had smaller experiments involving mind control. Operation Midnight Climax was one of these experiments, and the CIA threw everything ethical out of the window using the unholy trinity of sex, drugs, and alcohol. First off, the CIA set up a series of brothels in San Francisco and New York, two of the largest and most sex-craved cities in the country. They hired some sex workers to lure random men into these brothels before they were given drinks spiked with LSD. While that was happening, CIA agents were watching from a two-way mirror, taking notes of what was happening between these men and the sex workers as they treated it almost like entertainment. The CIA eventually expanded Operation Midnight Climax by drugging people in bars, restaurants, and beaches. So if you were one of those unsuspecting men, you'd think that you'd be spending the night with a happy ending with some hot girl you found on the street. Instead, you are getting drugged by the government, all because the CIA wanted to test out how LSD and other drugs could be used for interrogation and mind control. Soviet Poison Laboratories, USSR. If you were wondering how the Soviet Union was able to produce some of the deadliest poisons known to man, then you should know that they didn't stumble upon these substances by sheer luck. Numerous laboratories were set up all over the USSR during the dark times of the Soviet poison laboratories experiments. The goal was to find the perfect, undetectable poison that could kill people without leaving a trace. Of course, because they needed actual people to test the poisons on, the perfect candidates were the guys who had already marked themselves for death when they went against the Soviet Union. That's why the Soviets brought in political prisoners and rebels, as they were the perfect candidates for the experiments. Not even these prisoners knew what was happening because they were told that they were receiving medication or undergoing harmless tests. In most cases, the scientists gave their test subjects meals or drinks disguised as medication, but were actually laced with odorless poison. The Soviets started using different types of poisons on these prisoners to test out which ones were the best for assassinations. Meanwhile, the test subjects were unaware of the poisonous substances until they found themselves lying on the ground with saliva foaming from their mouths as they suffered and died. Holmesburg Prison Experiments, USA. Put yourself in the position of a prison inmate during the 1950s and 60s while the rest of the country became more obsessed with cosmetic and skincare products in pursuit of artificial beauty. But this beauty came with a cost: your own skin while you were behind bars. The people behind the Holmesburg prison experiments thought that no one would mind conducting tests on people who were probably never going to see the light of day again while in prison. Numerous substances and diseases were tested on their skin. In some cases, they became test subjects for acne treatments and shampoo, but in other cases, they were guinea pigs for diseases like herpes and dangerous substances like dioxin. Of course, the inmates volunteered because they were desperate for anything. Some of them agreed to join the tests for money and cigarettes, not knowing the potential long-term side effects of these tests. They were essentially coerced into becoming test subjects before realizing that they would come out of these experiments with a face not even their mothers would love. The experiments resulted in severe burns and rashes. Some inmates suffered long-term health issues, especially after getting exposed to radioactive substances, all in the name of science and profits. Stargate Project, USA. During the Cold War, America and the CIA sought any advantage over their rivals, believing that the next level of warfare and intelligence could be found in the psychic realm. Yes, the CIA thought that there could be a potential to weaponize psychic abilities if ever this stuff actually existed. Of course, you might think, hey, that's kind of cool, especially if you're into sci-fi movies and books exploring psychic powers. But the experiments were downright shady, turning the project into a dark, unethical episode. The CIA recruited people without disclosing everything about the experiment. The participants were unwittingly subjected to psychological manipulation and were forced to endure intense training meant to improve psychic abilities. These test subjects came into the experiment believing that they were going to come out of it with Professor X's powers, only for them to get a good dose of drugs with a side of psychological health issues. As a result, the participants suffered mental distress, anxiety, and other mental health issues because they were forced to take part in intense psychic training sessions. Some of the participants were so mentally scarred that they falsely believed that they had psychic powers. Unfortunately, the Stargate project went down the drain when it became clear that there was no way to prove whether or not psychic powers existed. They couldn't weaponize something that's probably fictional, wasting millions of taxpayers' money, $500,000 a year to be exact, while causing immeasurable harm to the subjects of the experiments. Operation Sea Spray, USA. It was the 1950s, and America was still paranoid from the events of World War II, when the US dropped nukes on Japan and used all sorts of unethical weapons on their enemies. You'd understand why the US would think that a similar attack could happen on their shores at any given moment. In 1950, the US government thought it was a good idea to spray bacteria all over the city of San Francisco in an experiment called Operation Sea Spray. The goal was to simulate a biological attack to see what would happen in a similar but bigger and more dangerous situation. The US used a type of bacteria they thought was harmless. The government only wanted to see how quickly the bacteria would spread in a city that had nearly 800,000 residents. However, these germs were anything but innocent, as 11 people ended up in the hospital after suffering from urinary tract infections related to the bacteria. 10 people recovered, but one guy died from complications caused by the bacteria because his heart got infected. What's surprising is that San Francisco had no idea they were guinea pigs in this seemingly twisted government experiment. What you'd think was a normal day of strolling around the city turned out to be a bad encounter with bacteria-laced air. Meanwhile, we on this channel have also been infected by a rare bacteria called Bacillus discordius, which can only be cured if we have enough likes on this channel. You can help us by joining our Discord. Agent Orange Experiments, USA. During the Vietnam War, the Americans were getting badly beaten up by their Vietnam enemies, who were using home court advantage by hiding out in the forests and hitting the US soldiers hard before retreating into the woods again. The Americans had enough of this shit and decided to defoliate the forests using an herbicide called Agent Orange. But before the US unleashed this chemical weapon in Vietnam, the Americans tested it out on their own soil, using Agent Orange on American soldiers and prisoners to study what would happen if their soldiers in Vietnam were exposed to this chemical. Without their informed consent, the people exposed to those toxic chemicals developed severe health problems. That's because Agent Orange contains dioxin, which is a compound that's linked to cancer and birth defects. The test subjects suffered illnesses and conditions that affected them for the rest of their lives. All these tests were done in secret, making it clear that the participants weren't aware of what they got themselves into. America eventually used Agent Orange in Vietnam, exposing 4 million Vietnamese citizens to its effects. As many as 3 million people in Vietnam suffered illnesses due to this compound. Meanwhile, as many as 39,000 US soldiers were exposed to Agent Orange while serving in the Vietnam War. Project 4.1, USA. It goes without saying that nuclear radiation is harmful for your health. But back when nuclear energy was still the new girl in the neighborhood of weaponry, the US was curious enough to see precisely how bad radiation is to the human body. They were like, hey, let's see what happens when we expose humans to nukes. That's what happened in Project 4.1. So with that, they nuked Bikini Atoll over at the Marshall Islands, exposing the people to the nuclear fallout from the explosion. They turned paradise into hell in a second by blowing up the most potent weapon in the history of mankind, turning a perfectly innocent island into ground zero. Of course, the radiation from the nuclear explosions affected the nearby islanders, who never even knew what the US was doing. Picture yourself just living a simple island life on your beachside home before seeing a giant mushroom cloud on the horizon. While you thought that you were safe, you started getting sick days after the explosion. People started losing hair and suffered skin damage from the fallout, as US scientists studied them way before sending in the medical cavalry to assist them. In 2010, it turned out that 55% of the cancer cases in the Marshall Islands could be traced to the radiation from Project 4.1. Operation Whitecoat, USA. Operation Whitecoat isn't some kind of secret federal program to recruit doctors into the government. Instead, it was a program that tested biological weapons in the hopes of gaining an edge over the Soviet Union during the early part of the Cold War. The problem was that the US Army didn't have anyone they could use as guinea pigs for their tests. So when they found out that the people of the Seventh-day Adventist religion were against military service, the Army offered them a chance to serve their country by acting as test subjects instead of going out on the field to fight communists. But while the Army looked like heroes who wanted to save the lives of men who didn't want to fight wars, they suffered fates worse than death. These men, nicknamed Whitecoats, were exposed to pathogens like Q fever and tularemia. So yeah, the Army was like, okay, if you don't want to die on the battlefield, you'll die in the lab. The Whitecoats didn't even know what they were getting into, because they were only told that they were contributing to medical research. They were infected with different diseases, including yellow fever, hepatitis A, and Rift Valley fever, so that the scientists could test antibiotics on them. The tests successfully produced treatments for these diseases, but at the cost of the health of the Whitecoats. None of the Whitecoats died during the testing, but a handful of those test subjects reported that they were suffering from lingering health effects. Some of them claimed that they suffered serious health problems because of the experiments. Operation Big Itch. Barely a decade after the end of World War II, the US had moved on from testing out nuclear weapons and was now into a somewhat safer warfare option, biological weapons. This is where Operation Big Itch came into the picture as an experiment that can leave goosebumps on your skin. So instead of looking into big explosives, the US thought that it would be a better idea to make their enemies sick instead. That way, there would be no nuclear fallout to clean up. The focus was on the same flea known for spreading the bubonic plague hundreds of years ago. Someone in the government must have said, hey, you guys remember the medieval plague, right? Maybe it's a good idea to use it against our enemies. The idea was to find a way to load these fleas into bombs. So instead of dropping nukes on their enemies, the US would be dropping canisters full of creepy crawlies, stealthily spreading diseases all over entire countries. Numerous tests were conducted. Millions of these fleas were packed into special bombs meant to burst open mid-air, releasing these blood-sucking parasites over a large area. These test drops were thankfully done in areas with little to no people. The goal was to test whether or not the fleas would survive the drop and how fast they would spread. One of the tests even malfunctioned and bit the people on the plane, infecting them with diseases. The results showed that this method of biological warfare was technically possible because the fleas survived the initial explosion and would have decimated an entire population. However, Operation Big Itch got scratched because it was too inhumane. Thankfully, the US never got to use it in another war, or else it would have possibly caused the second coming of the bubonic plague.